The Delta Airlines flight from Seattle to Miami was cruising at 35,000 feet when passengers in first class noticed her immediately, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. While executives frantically typed on laptops and socialites posted Instagram stories, she slept peacefully in 2A, her weathered leather jacket draped like armor across her shoulders. Her face was turned toward the window, dark hair falling in waves that couldn't quite hide the thin scar running from her left temple to her jaw. Most passengers assumed she was just another frequent flyer catching up on sleep. The 6 Navy SEALs in business class knew better. They'd been returning from a classified operation in South America when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez spotted her boarding. He'd elbowed his team leader, Petty Officer Martinez, and whispered something that made all 6 men go rigid in their seats. For the next 3 hours, they'd taken turns stealing glances at the sleeping woman, their usual bravado replaced by something between respect and unease. "That can't be her," whispered Seaman Torres, the youngest of the group. "Ghost doesn't fly commercial." Martinez shot him a look that could have melted steel. "Keep your voice down, kid, and don't ever use that call sign unless you're prepared to explain why you know it." The woman's eyes opened slowly, as if she'd sensed their scrutiny across the cabin. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge them, just stared out at the endless expanse of clouds below. Her fingers absently traced the edge of a small silver pendant hanging from her neck, a stylized aircraft silhouette that none of the passengers would recognize, but that made the SEALs exchange knowing looks. It was the insignia of a unit that officially didn't exist, from operations that had never been recorded, in places that remained classified even decades after the fact. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, the SEAL team's leader, had heard the stories whispered in the darkest corners of military intelligence. A pilot who'd flown missions so secret that her service record was almost entirely redacted. Someone who'd earned her call sign not through skill alone, but through something far more dangerous: the ability to appear and disappear like smoke, to complete impossible missions that left enemy forces wondering if they'd encountered a ghost or a guardian angel. Flight attendant Ashley Chen approached with the drink cart, her practiced smile faltering slightly as she noticed the tension radiating from the business class section. The woman in first class ordered coffee, black, no sugar, without looking away from the window. Her voice was soft but carried an authority that made seasoned combat veterans sit up straighter in their seats 3 rows back. As the Boeing 737 began its descent into Miami, none of the passengers could have imagined that the quiet woman in first class was about to become the center of the most classified rescue operation in modern military history. The morning sun painted the Miami skyline in shades of gold and amber as Captain Alina, Ghost, Restrepo felt the familiar sensation of controlled descent. 23 years of military aviation had trained her body to read aircraft movement like poetry. Every subtle vibration of the engines, every shift in air pressure, every gentle correction the pilots made as they lined up with runway 8R. She'd flown this approach countless times, but never as a passenger, never without her hands on the controls. Behind her, the SEALs were growing increasingly agitated. She could feel their eyes boring into the back of her head, could sense their whispered conversations even over the drone of the engines. They were good, better than most, but they hadn't learned the first rule of covert operations. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one nobody noticed. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made her stomach drop. The text was simple: package compromised, immediate extraction required, authorization, Blackbird 77. She recognized the code immediately. It was the emergency frequency for Operation Nightfall, a mission she'd helped design but had hoped would never be activated. The fact that they were reaching out to her, a pilot who'd been officially retired for 6 months, meant the situation was worse than classified. She stood smoothly, gathering her jacket and carry-on with practiced efficiency. The movement was fluid, economical, the kind that spoke of thousands of hours in cramped cockpits and hostile environments. As she passed the SEAL team, Martinez caught her eye for just a moment. She saw recognition there, along with something else: concern. These men had been briefed on her operations, had probably read the sanitized versions of her mission reports. They knew what Ghost meant in their world, and they knew that if she was being activated, someone was in serious trouble. The aircraft touched down with barely a bump, a textbook landing that would have impressed her if she hadn't been calculating tactical vectors in her head. Miami International was a target-rich environment: multiple runways, civilian traffic, limited security in certain sectors. If someone needed extraction from this location, it suggested either a blown cover operation or something far worse. Her fingers traced the aircraft pendant again, an unconscious gesture that dated back to her first combat mission over Bosnia. The small piece of silver had been with her through 17 countries, 43 combat sorties, and more classified operations than she was legally allowed to remember. As passengers began the familiar dance of deplaning, Alina remained seated until the business class section had cleared. The SEALs filed past her without acknowledgement, but she caught the subtle hand gesture Martinez made as he passed, a tactical signal that meant "watch your six." They knew something she didn't, which was both unusual and concerning. In her experience, when Navy SEALs were worried about a pilot's safety, that pilot was probably already in more danger than they realized. The terminal buzzed with typical Miami energy: tourists in bright colors, business travelers checking phones, families reuniting with dramatic embraces. Alina moved through the crowd like water, invisible and purposeful. Her trained eyes automatically cataloged potential threats: the man in the dark suit who'd been on her flight and was now lingering near the baggage claim, the woman in designer clothes whose purse bulged in a way that suggested more than makeup and credit cards, the airport security guard whose posture was too rigid for routine duty. 23 years of military service had taught her that paranoia was just another word for situational awareness. The fact that she'd been contacted using Blackbird protocols meant that someone, somewhere, had decided she was the only pilot capable of handling whatever crisis was unfolding. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, her commanding officers had suggested she was too valuable to risk on active operations. Now they were pulling her back in because she was apparently too valuable not to risk. She found a quiet corner near a Cuban coffee stand and activated the encrypted communication app on her phone. The response was immediate: a set of coordinates that placed her at Miami Executive Airport, a smaller facility 20 miles west that catered to private aircraft and government operations. The follow-up message was even more concerning: time critical, friendly assets in hostile territory. You're the only pilot with clearance for target zone. Alina ordered a cortadito from the Cuban woman behind the counter, using the time to study the reflection in the chrome espresso machine. The man in the dark suit was still there, now joined by a woman whose aggressive surveillance techniques screamed federal agent. They weren't trying to hide their interest, which meant either they were amateurs or they wanted her to know she was being watched. Given the activation of Blackbird protocols, she suspected the latter. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a voice message, scrambled through so many layers of encryption that it sounded like whispers from another dimension. But she recognized the voice immediately: General Patricia Hawkins, one of the few people who'd had complete access to Alina's classified service record. "Ghost, we need you airborne in 2 hours. Asset recovery in hostile territory. Presidential authority. Your country is asking you to fly one more time." Alina sipped her coffee and smiled grimly. She'd been hoping for a quiet retirement, maybe some contract work training civilian pilots. But the military had a way of making retirement feel more like an extended leave of absence. She deleted the message, finished her coffee, and walked calmly toward the exit, already calculating flight times, fuel requirements, and tactical approaches for whatever impossible mission they were about to ask her to fly. The drive to Miami Executive Airport gave Alina time to think, which in her experience was usually either a blessing or a curse. The radio chatter from her encrypted communications device painted a picture that grew more concerning with each mile. Multiple agencies were involved: CIA, NSA, and at least 2 military special operations units. The target zone was somewhere in the Caribbean, exact coordinates still classified even for her clearance level. Most troubling was the repeated use of the phrase time-critical asset recovery, which in military speak usually meant someone important was about to die if they didn't get help soon. She'd driven this route hundreds of times during her active service, back when Miami Executive served as a staging point for operations throughout Central and South America. The facility looked the same: nondescript hangars, minimal civilian traffic, and the kind of security presence that managed to be both invisible and omnipresent. The difference was that now she was arriving as a contractor rather than active military, which meant fewer protections and more liability if things went sideways. The guard at the main gate checked her ID with the thoroughness of someone who'd been given very specific orders about who to expect. She noticed the subtle way he photographed her license, and the discreet earpiece that meant he was reporting her arrival to someone important. Professional paranoia was a hard habit to break, especially when that paranoia had kept her alive through 23 years of flying missions that ranged from merely dangerous to absolutely suicidal. Hangar 7 looked exactly as she remembered: a cavernous space that could house aircraft ranging from small reconnaissance planes to medium transport helicopters. What she didn't expect was the collection of vehicles parked outside: 2 black SUVs with government plates, a military Humvee that looked fresh from deployment, and a civilian sedan that probably contained more surveillance equipment than most police departments. Someone was taking this operation very seriously. Inside the hangar, she stopped and stared. Sitting in the center of the space like a predatory bird was an aircraft she recognized but hadn't expected to see again: a modified MH-6 Little Bird, painted in the flat gray that designated special operations use. The helicopter was smaller than most people imagined, barely large enough for a pilot and 4 passengers, but it had been designed for exactly the kind of mission she suspected they were about to ask her to fly: low-level insertion into hostile territory with minimal radar signature and maximum maneuverability. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" The voice came from behind her, crisp and professional with just a hint of southern accent. Alina turned to face a woman in her 50s, silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing the kind of civilian clothes that screamed military intelligence. "General Hawkins," Alina said, offering a slight nod. "I should have known you'd be here personally. When we need the best pilot for an impossible mission, I make sure to ask personally," Hawkins replied. "Walk with me, Ghost. We need to talk." They moved toward a secure briefing room Alina remembered from countless pre-mission meetings. The walls were lined with maps showing the Caribbean basin, satellite photographs of various islands, and weather charts that suggested tropical storm activity in the target zone. It was the kind of setup that usually preceded the sort of mission that made pilots update their wills. Alina studied the tactical displays while Hawkins poured coffee from a military-issue thermos. The satellite photos showed a small island, maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide, with what appeared to be a small airstrip and several buildings. Red circles marked various structures, while blue symbols indicated water depths and potential landing zones. It looked like a standard reconnaissance package, except for the timestamp showing the photos had been taken less than 6 hours ago. "3 days ago, one of our deep cover assets went silent," Hawkins began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd sent too many good people into harm's way. "Intelligence analyst, been working the Caribbean drug cartels for 18 months. Yesterday, we received a coded transmission indicating she'd been burned and needed immediate extraction." She paused, sipping her coffee while Alina absorbed the implications. "Problem is, she's being held on a private island controlled by people who shoot first and never bother with questions." Alina studied the photos more carefully. The island showed signs of heavy security, guard towers, patrol boats, and what looked like surface-to-air missile emplacements. It was the kind of target that required either a full military assault or the sort of precision operation that only a few pilots in the world could execute. She was beginning to understand why they'd pulled her out of retirement. The extraction window is 8 hours, Hawkins continued. After that, our asset either gets moved to a location we can't reach or she disappears permanently. We need someone who can get in low and fast, avoid detection, extract one person and get out before anyone realizes what happened. In other words, we need Ghost. Alina set down her coffee and looked directly at her former commanding officer. What aren't you telling me, General? This sounds like a job for Navy SEALs or Delta Force. You don't need a pilot for a ground extraction unless there's something special about the approach or the target zone. Hawkins smiled grimly. The island has radar coverage that extends 20 miles in every direction, plus patrol boats with sophisticated sonar equipment. Conventional approach methods won't work, too much chance of early detection. But there's a gap in their coverage, a narrow corridor that requires flying at wave-top level through a series of coral reefs during a specific tidal window. The margin for error is measured in feet, and the weather window is closing fast. Alina studied the charts again, this time focusing on the approach vectors and tidal information. It was indeed a nightmare scenario, flying a helicopter at maximum speed just inches above ocean swells, threading through coral formations that could tear an aircraft apart if the pilot made even a minor miscalculation. Add in the time pressure and the tactical situation, and it became the sort of mission that separated truly exceptional pilots from merely good ones. There's something else, Hawkins said quietly. The asset we're extracting. She specifically requested you. Used your old call sign in her transmission. Whatever she's discovered, she trusts you more than any other pilot in our inventory. That changed everything. Alina had worked with dozens of intelligence analysts over the years, but only a few knew her well enough to request her specifically for an extraction. If someone was using her call sign and asking for her by name, it meant this wasn't just another routine asset recovery. Someone she'd worked with before was in serious trouble, and they believed she was their only chance of getting home alive. The briefing room fell silent except for the distant hum of aircraft engines from other hangars. Alina walked to the window and stared out at the little bird, its rotor blades folded back like the wings of a sleeping predator. She'd flown similar aircraft through hostile territory more times than she cared to count, had extracted soldiers and civilians from situations that ranged from merely dangerous to absolutely hopeless. But 6 months of retirement had softened her edge slightly, had allowed her to imagine a life where other people took the impossible risks while she stayed safely on the ground. "General," she said finally, "I need complete operational autonomy. No oversight, no second-guessing from headquarters, no politicians trying to manage the mission from Washington. If I'm going to fly into hostile territory to extract an intelligence asset, I do it my way or not at all." Hawkins nodded. "Done. You'll have complete tactical control once you're airborne. We'll provide intelligence updates and weather information, but the operational decisions are yours." She paused, studying Alina's reflection in the window. "There's one more thing. The asset we're extracting. Her name is Captain Maria Santos, intel analyst but also a pilot. She specifically mentioned that Ghost would understand the tactical situation better than anyone else." Alina felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Maria Santos had been one of her students during advanced tactical flight training 3 years ago, a brilliant analyst who'd crossed over to aviation, because she understood that sometimes the best intelligence came from personally observing the target. If Maria was requesting Ghost specifically, it meant she'd found something important enough to risk her cover, and dangerous enough that she needed the most skilled extraction pilot available. "When do I launch?" Alina asked, already knowing the answer would be sooner than she'd like. "Sunset," Hawkins replied. "The tidal window opens at 2100 hours, and you'll need every minute of darkness to avoid detection. Weather reports show a tropical storm system moving through the area, which will provide cover but also make the approach more dangerous. Alina looked at her watch. 4 hours to prepare for a mission that would require split-second timing, perfect weather judgment, and the kind of flying skills that she'd spent 2 decades developing. It was barely enough time to review the technical specifications of the aircraft, study the approach routes, and run through emergency procedures. But it would have to be enough. Maria Santos was counting on her, and Alina had never left a fellow pilot behind. The pre-flight preparation took on an almost ritual quality. Alina inspected every inch of the MH-6 Little Bird with the methodical thoroughness that had kept her alive through hundreds of combat missions. The aircraft was in perfect condition, engine recently overhauled, rotor blades balanced to military specifications, avionics upgraded with the latest navigation and communication equipment. Someone had spared no expense in preparing this helicopter for what was likely to be one of the most dangerous missions of her career. The weapons loadout was minimal but effective. Door-mounted M240 machine guns for suppressive fire, emergency flares, and electronic countermeasures designed to jam enemy radar and communications. More importantly, the aircraft had been fitted with extended-range fuel tanks and specialized navigation equipment for low-level flight over water. Every modification suggested a mission profile that matched her worst fears about what she was being asked to do. Her flight suit felt familiar despite 6 months out of the cockpit. Nomex fabric designed to protect against fire, multiple pockets containing survival equipment, and the weight of body armor that pilots wore during hostile territory operations. The helmet was new, fitted with night vision goggles and a communication system that would keep her in contact with both the rescue coordinators and Maria Santos once she reached the target zone. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Alina ran through her final equipment checks. Emergency beacon, survival radio, sidearm with extra ammunition, water purification tablets, high-energy food bars, and a first aid kit designed for treating gunshot wounds. The gear represented the difference between a routine extraction and a life-or-death survival situation if something went wrong during the mission. The weather briefing painted a complex picture of competing atmospheric systems. The tropical storm was moving faster than initially predicted, which meant she'd have strong tailwinds during the approach but potentially dangerous crosswinds during the extraction. More concerning was the forecast for heavy rain squalls that could reduce visibility to near zero without warning. Flying at wave-top level through coral reefs was challenging enough in perfect conditions. Doing it in tropical storm weather would require every skill she developed over 2 decades of military aviation. Her final briefing came from a CIA operative who looked young enough to be her son, but spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent considerable time in the field. The intelligence picture was grim. The island was controlled by a cartel organization with military-grade weapons and training. They had patrol boats, surface-to-air missiles, and the kind of disciplined security that made surprise attacks extremely difficult. The fact that they'd managed to identify and capture a deep-cover intelligence operative suggested they had their own sources within the U.S. intelligence community. The good news, the operative concluded, is that they probably don't expect an extraction attempt this soon. Intelligence assets are usually considered expendable in situations like this, too risky to recover, too dangerous to leave operational. They're probably planning to interrogate Captain Santos for a few more days before deciding what to do with her. Alina absorbed the briefing information while studying aerial photographs of the target island. The extraction point was a small beach on the northeastern shore, accessible only during high tide, and only if she could thread the helicopter through a gap in the coral reef that was barely wider than the aircraft's rotor diameter. The margin for error was essentially zero. One miscalculation would either crash the helicopter into coral formations or put them close enough to shore that the island's security forces could engage with small arms fire. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Alina walked out to the flight line where the little bird waited like a mechanical predator. The aircraft looked smaller and more fragile than she remembered, which was probably accurate. Helicopters were never designed for the kinds of missions she'd flown over the years. They survived through pilot skill, mechanical reliability, and the kind of luck that tended to abandon aviators who pushed their aircraft too far beyond design limitations. She performed her final walk-around inspection by flashlight, checking for loose panels, fluid leaks, or any other signs of mechanical problems that could turn the mission into a disaster. The aircraft was perfect, which somehow made her more nervous than if she'd found minor defects to worry about. Perfect aircraft meant that if something went wrong during the mission, it would be due to pilot error, enemy action, or the kind of mechanical failure that happened without warning at the worst possible moment. Her hands moved through the startup sequence with muscle memory developed over thousands of hours of flight time. Engine temperatures, hydraulic pressure, electrical systems, navigation equipment, each gauge and indicator told part of the story of whether the aircraft was ready for combat operations. The little bird responded like a thoroughbred, every system functioning within normal parameters, ready for whatever impossible task she was about to ask it to perform. As the rotor blades began their familiar wop-wop-wop rhythm, Alina felt the familiar transformation that happened every time she slipped into combat mode. Civilian concerns faded away, replaced by the hyper-aware state of consciousness that military pilots called the zone, a mental space where time slowed down, situational awareness expanded, and split-second decisions became as natural as breathing. She was no longer Alina Restrepo, retired pilot trying to figure out civilian life. She was Ghost, and someone who'd served with her was in trouble. The flight to the target zone would take 2 hours at maximum cruise speed, flying a route that took her over the Florida Keys and into international waters before turning southwest toward the Caribbean. It was a familiar route. She'd flown similar missions during her active duty years, usually carrying special operations forces toward objectives that appeared on no official maps. The difference was that tonight she was flying alone, with no backup, toward a target where failure meant that both she and Maria Santos would disappear into the kind of classified footnote that families were never allowed to read. The lights of Miami faded behind her as the little bird skimmed across the dark waters of the Florida Straits. Below, she could see the running lights of cargo ships and fishing vessels, normal maritime traffic that had no idea that a military rescue operation was unfolding in the darkness above them. The contrast was striking, peaceful civilian activity continuing while she flew toward what might be the most dangerous mission of her career. Her communication system crackled to life with updates from the Rescue Coordination Center. Maria Santos was confirmed to still be alive and held in a compound on the southern side of the island. Enemy patrol patterns had been observed and recorded, suggesting routine security protocols rather than heightened alert status. Weather conditions remained marginal but within acceptable limits for the extraction window. All systems indicated that the mission was proceeding according to plan, which in Alina's experience usually meant they were about 5 minutes away from everything going catastrophically wrong. The tropical storm system became visible as a wall of towering thunderheads illuminated by internal lightning. Flying through severe weather in a small helicopter required a combination of skill, judgment, and acceptance that some atmospheric conditions were powerful enough to destroy any aircraft regardless of pilot ability. Alina adjusted her course to thread between the largest storm cells, using her weather radar to identify gaps in the precipitation that might allow safe passage toward the target zone. As she penetrated the outer edges of the storm system, turbulence began shaking the little bird with increasing intensity. Rain hammered against the windscreen with enough force to make conversation impossible even through the intercom system. Lightning flashes illuminated towering cloud formations that rose far above the helicopter's service ceiling, atmospheric monuments to forces that made human engineering seem fragile and temporary. This was the kind of weather that turned routine missions into survival exercises, where reaching the target zone became less important than simply remaining airborne. Her navigation equipment showed the target island bearing 185 degrees, distance 43 nautical miles. The approach route would take her through the worst of the storm system, but the weather would also provide concealment from enemy radar systems. It was the kind of tactical trade-off that defined special operations, accepting increased natural hazards in order to reduce the probability of detection by hostile forces. Alina had made similar calculations hundreds of times over the years, balancing risk factors that could kill her in different ways. The radio crackled with an encrypted transmission from the Rescue Coordination Center. Ghost, be advised that enemy patrol boats have increased activity in the target zone. Intelligence suggests possible heightened security status. Abort criteria remain unchanged, but recommend extreme caution during approach phase. Alina acknowledged the transmission while calculating the tactical implications. Increased patrol boat activity could mean several things: routine security exercises, response to the storm system, or indication that Maria Santos's captors were expecting some kind of rescue attempt. If the enemy was actively watching for approaching aircraft, her margin for error became even smaller. She would need to fly the approach route with absolute precision, threading through coral reefs while avoiding both natural hazards and enemy detection. The storm reached peak intensity as she crossed into international waters. Wind gusts strong enough to flip the helicopter were channeled between towering thunderheads that rose like dark cathedrals into the night sky. Alina fought the aircraft's controls with steady pressure, using decades of experience to anticipate wind shear and turbulence before the aircraft felt their effects. Flying in severe weather was like dancing with a partner who was trying to kill you. Success required understanding the rhythm of destruction while avoiding its embrace. Through gaps in the storm clouds, she caught glimpses of the target island's silhouette against lightning-illuminated seas. The landmass looked smaller and more isolated than the satellite photographs had suggested, a dark speck surrounded by white-capped waves that indicated dangerous surf conditions. The extraction would require landing on a beach that was probably no more than 50 yards long, in weather that was marginal for any helicopter operation, while enemy forces with military weapons tried to prevent her from leaving. Her hands moved automatically through the pre-combat checklist, while her mind calculated approach vectors and emergency escape routes. Weapon systems armed, navigation equipment set for low-level flight, communication frequencies programmed for contact with Maria Santos. Every switch and dial represented preparation for contingencies that could develop without warning: mechanical failure, enemy contact, weather conditions that exceeded the aircraft's capabilities. The difference between successful extraction and disaster often came down to preparations made during the approach phase, when there was still time to think clearly about potential problems. The target island's radar signature appeared on her threat detection system as she closed to within 20 miles of the extraction zone. The enemy had sophisticated equipment, military-grade search radars that could detect aircraft at considerable distance under normal circumstances. Her salvation was flying at wave-top altitude through a tropical storm, conditions that created so much electronic noise that even the best radar systems had difficulty distinguishing aircraft from weather phenomena. She was essentially hiding in plain sight, using the storm's energy to mask her approach. At 10 miles from the target, Alina began the most dangerous phase of the mission. The coral reef approach required flying between formations that rose from the ocean floor like underwater mountains, following a route that was barely wide enough to accommodate the little bird's rotor diameter. Navigation had to be perfect, Too far left or right would result in rotor blade contact with coral formations, an impact that would destroy the helicopter instantly. The approach required maintaining precise altitude and heading, while compensating for wind gusts that could push the aircraft off course without warning. Her night vision goggles turned the dark ocean into a green-tinted landscape of crashing waves and coral formations that glowed with phosphorescent intensity. The reef passage looked like a tunnel carved through an alien landscape, with towering coral walls rising on both sides of the narrow channel that led toward the island's beach. Alina had flown similar approaches during her active duty career, but never in weather this severe, and never with so much depending on perfect execution. The little bird responded to her control inputs with the precision of a well-tuned instrument, but she could feel the aircraft struggling against wind conditions that were near the limits of its design capabilities. Crosswinds tried to push the helicopter sideways into coral formations, while downdrafts threatened to drive the aircraft into the churning ocean below. Success required constant small corrections, adjustments measured in inches and degrees that kept the aircraft centered in the narrow passage between destruction and detection. Her communication system picked up the first transmission from Maria Santos, a brief, coded message that confirmed her location and indicated she was prepared for immediate extraction. The voice was calm and professional despite circumstances that would have terrified most people, the kind of composure that Alina recognized from her own years of operating in hostile territory. Maria was scared but functional, which meant the extraction had a reasonable chance of success if Alina could navigate the final approach without alerting the island's security forces. The beach appeared through her night vision goggles as a narrow strip of sand bordered by vegetation that could conceal enemy positions. Alina could see no signs of hostile activity, but that meant nothing. Professional security forces would remain concealed until the last possible moment. The extraction would require landing on sand that might not support the helicopter's weight, shutting down systems that would be needed for immediate departure, and trusting that Maria Santos could reach the extraction point without being detected or intercepted by hostile forces. As the little bird's skids touched sand for the first time in over 2 hours, Alina realized that the most dangerous part of the mission was just beginning. Getting to the island had required exceptional flying skills and considerable luck. Getting Maria Santos back to safety would require both of those things plus the kind of tactical judgment that separated successful extractions from memorial services. She kept the rotors turning at idle power while scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, ready to lift off immediately if the situation deteriorated from rescue operation to combat engagement. The extraction point looked different from ground level than it had in satellite photographs. What had appeared to be a simple beach landing zone was actually a narrow strip of sand flanked by coral formations that limited maneuvering options and vegetation thick enough to conceal an entire platoon of enemy soldiers. Alina kept the little bird's engines spooled up to flight idle, ready for immediate takeoff while maintaining enough noise discipline to avoid alerting security forces that might be patrolling nearby areas. Her night vision goggles revealed movement in the tree line, a single figure moving with the practiced stealth of someone trained in reconnaissance techniques. Maria Santos emerged from concealment exactly where the mission briefing had indicated she would be, but Alina noticed immediately that something was wrong. Maria's movement was too careful, too deliberate, suggesting either injury or the presence of enemy forces closer than intelligence had indicated. The extraction was proceeding according to plan, but the tactical situation felt more dangerous than the briefing had suggested. Maria approached the helicopter with her hands clearly visible, following protocols designed to prevent friendly fire incidents during night extractions. Even through night vision goggles, Alina could see that her former student had lost weight during her time undercover, and her movements suggested someone who'd been living under extreme stress for an extended period. More concerning was the way Maria constantly checked her surroundings, indicating that she believed enemy forces were nearby and actively searching for her. "Ghost, we need to move fast," Maria said as she climbed into the passenger compartment. Her voice carried the controlled tension of someone operating at the limits of their stress tolerance. "They know I'm missing, and they've got patrol teams searching this section of the island. We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach this area." Lena acknowledged the warning while running through her departure checklist with practiced efficiency. 10 minutes was an eternity in some tactical situations, and barely enough time in others. Everything would depend on how quickly she could get the little bird airborne, and how effectively she could navigate the coral reef passage in reverse, while potentially under fire from enemy forces. The weather hadn't improved during the brief ground phase, which meant the departure would be just as dangerous as the approach had been. "What did you find that was worth burning your cover?" Alina asked as she pulled pitch and lifted the helicopter off the beach. "It must be something pretty significant to risk an extraction operation like this." Maria's response was interrupted by the sound of automatic weapons fire from somewhere in the vegetation behind them. Muzzle flashes lit up the tree line like deadly fireworks, and Alina could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close enough to the aircraft to be genuinely concerning. The enemy had found the extraction point faster than anticipated, which meant the return journey would be conducted under combat conditions rather than the stealth approach she'd planned. "They're not just running drugs," Maria shouted over the increasing noise of rotor blades and gunfire. "This operation is funding something much bigger. They've got connections to international arms dealers, and they're moving weapons to groups that shouldn't have access to that kind of hardware. I found shipping manifests that show surface-to-air missiles, military-grade explosives, even some kind of chemical weapons." Alina processed the intelligence while maneuvering the little bird through the coral reef passage at maximum sustainable speed. The helicopter was heavier now with Maria aboard, which affected its performance characteristics and made the return navigation more challenging than the inbound approach. Add in the factor of enemy forces who were now aware of their presence, and the mission had transformed from difficult extraction to combat escape and evasion. She needed to get clear of the immediate area before enemy reinforcements could arrive with heavier weapons. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as they cleared the reef passage and headed for open ocean. Alina's threat detection system lit up with radar contacts that indicated patrol boats converging on their location from multiple directions. The enemy had responded faster and more effectively than intelligence estimates had suggested, which meant someone with military training was coordinating the pursuit. They were no longer dealing with simple drug smugglers. This was a sophisticated operation with the resources and expertise to conduct complex security operations. "Ghost, I'm reading multiple surface contacts closing on our position," came the transmission from Rescue Coordination Center. "Be advised that we're detecting surface-to-air missile radar signatures from at least 2 locations. Recommend immediate evasive action and consider alternate extraction routes." Alina was already implementing evasive maneuvers, flying the little bird in an unpredictable pattern designed to make targeting difficult for both radar-guided and visually aimed weapons systems. The helicopter's small size and maneuverability were advantages in this kind of engagement, but they were offset by the aircraft's vulnerability to any kind of successful hit. Unlike larger military helicopters, the little bird had minimal armor protection. Survival depended on not getting hit rather than absorbing damage. The first surface-to-air missile launch appeared as a bright streak of light rising from one of the patrol boats. Alina watched the missile's trajectory while calculating intercept angles and implementing countermeasures that might confuse the weapon's guidance system. Modern missiles were sophisticated enough to compensate for many evasive tactics, but they still had limitations that could be exploited by pilots with sufficient skill and experience. The key was understanding how the weapons worked and using that knowledge to create situations where successful intercepts became difficult or impossible. "Flares away," Alina announced as she deployed countermeasures designed to confuse heat-seeking missiles. The flares created bright thermal signatures that could potentially attract missiles away from the helicopter's engine exhaust, but their effectiveness depended on the sophistication of the weapons being used against them. Military-grade surface-to-air missiles were designed to distinguish between countermeasures and actual targets, which meant that flares alone might not be sufficient to ensure survival. The missile detonated close enough to create visible shrapnel patterns in the ocean below them, but far enough away to avoid causing damage to the aircraft. Alina used the brief respite to increase altitude and change course toward a vector that would take them away from the patrol boats while maintaining heading toward the extraction route. They weren't safe yet. Enemy forces were still actively pursuing them, but they'd survived the first engagement without damage, which improved their chances of reaching friendly territory. Maria was monitoring radio frequencies used by the cartel forces, providing Alina with intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. The information painted a concerning picture of an organization with military-level communication discipline and coordination capabilities. They were tracking the helicopter's movement with precision that suggested access to sophisticated radar equipment, and they were coordinating pursuit efforts across multiple platforms in a way that indicated professional military training. "They're calling in additional assets," Maria reported. "I'm hearing references to aircraft."